Welcome. This is David Winstead, and this is the program In the Know, and thank you for joining us. We have a wonderful guest today, Antonia Fasanelli, who is Executive Director of the National Law Center on Homelessness. And thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, as you know, this is a public station and provides information of interest. And I think everybody is very concerned and cares about the state of homelessness and people in their neighborhood that don't have shelter. And I know your law center is a major focus of effort to protect the laws and the rights of the homeless, but also look at how we improve the status of homelessness in America. You mentioned a bit earlier that they were like 12% increase in over last year to this year in terms of the amount of homeless in America. And I know in your background, you can tell us a little bit about your role before the Law Center, but you were in Baltimore and very much focused on homelessness in Baltimore.
Yes. And
also chaired the ABA Commission on Homelessness, which was, you had a great background and great expert. But can you talk a little bit about how we are, where we are now, and what the Law Center is doing to try to protect the rights of homeless and find housing for the homeless?
Absolutely, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here. So homelessness and really the condition of people not having a home of their own to live in is really reaching a crisis level in the United States. If we think about during the period of COVID, there were a great deal of federal protections that helped people retain their housing through rent relief and other kinds of programs. And really all of those programs have expired. And as a result, we have seen a great number of people losing their housing, unable to afford their housing, and forced into homelessness who are either seeking shelter or have no place to go but to sleep outside. Nationwide, we have about 650,000 people who experience homelessness. In the state of Maryland, that translates to about 6,000 people experiencing homelessness. In Baltimore City has the highest population of homelessness. Montgomery County actually has the second highest population of homelessness. Nearly 900 people experienced homelessness in Montgomery County last year, according to the point-in-time count. This is really a challenge for every community in the state of Maryland to be able to provide housing and services to people who do not have homes of their own.
So, Antonia, you mentioned that there were sort of pre-COVID some protections that are no longer there. Can you explain a little bit of how they expired and
Sure.
what the Law Center is doing to look at reinstituting them or advocating that, or other solutions to kind of provide the same level of protection?
Sure. Well, there was certainly infusion of federal dollars to help provide monies to local communities to distribute to residents who were having financial difficulties. So many of these monies went to rent relief programs to help people pay rent arrears when they lost their jobs during COVID. Many businesses closed, and so many people lost their jobs through no fault of their own and had no way to pay their income in order to pay their rent in order to retain their housing. There were also programs like the child tax credit expansion that provided refundable tax credits to families, again to help them be able to pay for critical life necessities like housing, food, and other things that families need to be able to survive. Those were all programs passed through Congress on a temporary basis. And so those programs expired really ultimately most by the end of 22 and into 23. And so what we are looking at now, and at the National Homelessness Law Center, we advocate for policies to end homelessness while we also defend the rights of unhoused people. So we are looking now at policies that will, on a permanent basis, expand the availability of housing for all people across the country. We can certainly talk about some of those policies in a moment, but we're looking for something much more permanent than existed during the period of COVID.
Interesting. So if you look, you mentioned Montgomery County and the status of 6,000 in the state. So I know that affordable housing is a major priority for the county executive, for the governor. You know, it's something that everybody recognizes as a real issue. So what is the link between, a homeless housing project would have advantage of tax exemption and other incentives to make it work, but why isn't there more ability to take the priority of affordable housing, which all the politicians are talking about, and have it impact the homeless shelter arena more than it has?
Sure. So it's really about the affordability of that housing. It's really critical that any community, and I will say that Montgomery County has been a leader in this arena, it's really critical that a community have tools and programs to create housing at all the income levels of the residents in their community. So Montgomery County has been a leader in inclusionary zoning to ensure that there is, in any new housing development, that there are units that are affordable, as well as market rate units. But the reality is that the supply has not kept up with the demand, even in a community like Montgomery County that has used these tools. As a nation, the federal government really has not invested in affordable housing development in decades. And as a result, even when a local community is committed to creating many different kinds of affordable housing developments, without that federal government investment, that community is ultimately going to fall behind. So one of the programs we are advocating for on the federal level, and you have joined me in this, is a program called the Federal Surplus Property Program. Right. It's a program that has existed since the late 1980s that allows state and local governments, as well as nonprofit organizations, to acquire vacant federal properties, buildings or vacant land, for reuse into housing or programs to serve unhoused people. This is a program that essentially gives free buildings and free land to state and local governments or nonprofits to create affordable housing. But as we know, this program has been significantly underutilized over the last several decades. It is a program that absolutely could be ramped up to create a pipeline of affordable housing quickly, because the program already exists in law. We just need the federal political will to support the program.
Got it. Antonia, one other reality, Title V and using surplus property to build a more cost-effective housing is for the homeless is one idea, but in almost every urban area, if you look at the 5 states, New York, California, the ones that really have urban homelessness issues, right now is kind of an interesting time and opportunity. It's unfortunate for the landowners, but the reality, the economics of many of the office buildings and other buildings in urban areas is gone. Most major landlords now are facing a very little value left in these buildings because of telework and the lack of utilization of that space. The average utilization of office buildings in DC now is 40% on an average day. And you can't maintain that. It's very hard for a landlord with that kind of occupancy. So this might be another area that the center, I know you're defending the laws and the rights and looking for solutions, but markets now in urban areas, many of which have the problems of homelessness, there's going to be more property available. If you can figure out how do you take the baseline of value in that building and be able to afford to, refit it for residential and homeless housing, it could be an opportunity over the coming years. I see it over the sort of next 3 years. There'll be a transition of buildings that are really obsolete for office at this point. So it's something you should maybe think about.
That's exactly right. And in fact, the Federal Surplus Property Program, as you mentioned, it's known colloquially as Title V, which is the title of the congressional act that created the program. That program allows for the conversion of federal office buildings. And so it really is a model for the conversion of office buildings that are not federally owned.
Right.
It's such an opportunity for local mayors, for state governors to look at converting office buildings into housing, and housing for all people. It doesn't just have to be housing for unhoused persons, but it should be, certainly some of those units should be available for unhoused persons. We should use this change in market to solve one of the most pressing housing issues we have today.
Right. I know there's a lot of sort of health-related issues with the homeless, and is it possible to be able to take some of these surplus property? I mean, on the federal side, it's you get the property at no cost, which gives you huge advantages to justify and build projects. But have you ever seen a mixed-use project where you've got homeless housing as well as affordable housing in the same project?
Absolutely,
Okay.
Or housing for unhoused persons in a building that's the rest of the building is not affordable. Someone who's unhoused is just someone who doesn't have a home.
Right.
It could be you or me if we lost our home.
Right.
And so it really a development that provides housing for someone who's unhoused. It just means that the rental units are affordable enough to someone who has no or very low income. But in terms of creating the community and the life in that building, none of the other tenants would know or would even need to know that someone had been unhoused. The idea is to create a community of people of multiple incomes, which is something that Montgomery County has done so well over the decades and very successfully.
And I know the Law Center focuses on the law and the rights issue, and we'll talk about that after our break. But are there enough developers of these projects that if a community saw availability of a building, that there's sort of models in terms of how do you finance a project of this nature? What are the considerations for, you'd have to put in obviously plumbing if you're looking at an office building and trying to create something residential. But they are projects that, and that group sort of has an affiliation with one another, and they sort of trade best practices and that kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely. And nationally, there are associations of affordable housing developers. Locally, there are associations as well. I think they would say they're always looking for new affordable housing developers, but there is a community of experienced developers who would be able to do that kind of conversion.
Gotcha.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Antonia, thank you. We're going to take a quick break. This is David Winstead, the program In the Know, and we have Antonia Fasanelli with us. And when we get back, we'll get into some of the cases that are coming up that are critical in terms of homeless rights and housing interests. And so we'll be right back.
When it comes to making plans, you are the best. Remember the best planned 90 minutes of your life? Or that surprise party for your parents' golden anniversary? You get the golden planning. The same way you plan each detail for those moments, start planning to protect you and your loved ones from a natural disaster. Sign up for local weather and emergency alerts. Prepare an emergency kit and make a family communications plan. Protecting your family is the best plan you can make.
Hi, this is David Winstead in the program In the Know, and we're going back to a great discussion we were having with Antonia Fasanelli, who's the head of the National Homelessness Law Center here in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Right on 16th Street.
Yes.
So Antonia, we talked a lot about the state of homelessness in the first portion, and then what the reality is and how you deal with the need for affordable housing. But why don't we switch a bit and focus on the Law Center and the tools it uses to both protect the rights of the homeless, but also how your team has had a lot of litigation experience, you too.
Yes.
So how do you go after laws that are pending or passed that really do impact adversely on the homeless? So why don't we talk a little bit about the center and sort of how you're structured and how you pursue these
Absolutely.
issues? Yeah.
So in addition to advocating for policies to end homelessness, we were talking before about federal policies to end homelessness, we do fiercely defend the rights of unhoused people all across the country. And we litigate in communities that have chosen wrongfully to penalize unhoused people, particularly when they have no place to go. One of the cases that we've been involved in for quite a number of years is a case called Grants Pass versus Johnson. This is a case that the U.S. Supreme Court is taking up this term and is a very important case about the rights of unhoused people and whether the U.S. Constitution protects unhoused people who literally have no place to go. So this case originated in small town Oregon. Grants Pass is a town of about 40,000 people, but in the last 20 years, the population doubled and the cost of housing rose tremendously, such that over half the residents of Grants Pass cannot afford the homes that exist there. That's actually not unusual.
Right.
A Harvard study recently found that over half of Americans cannot afford the housing in their local communities.
Right.
So Grants Pass is not alone in that regard.
Right.
But they are alone in the way that they responded to homelessness. So because half the residents could not afford housing, an increased number of residents were evicted from their homes because they weren't able to pay their rent. Grants Pass is unusual in that it actually does not have any free emergency shelter. So there literally was no place for evicted persons or persons who lost their home for other reasons. There was no place for them to go, except to sleep in public spaces or in their vehicles. What the town of Grants Pass did in response to the rising numbers of people sleeping outside was, instead of opening an emergency shelter or creating more housing and services, they decided to pass an ordinance making it essentially illegal to sleep outside or in your car with blankets and pillows. And so what happened was Gloria Johnson and many other unhoused people in Grants Pass were fined for sleeping outside even though they had no other place to go. So luckily, Gloria Johnson and other folks in Grants Pass were represented by the Oregon Law Center, who filed a lawsuit on their behalf saying that it is cruel and unusual punishment to punish someone for sleeping in a public place when they literally have no place to go. And the U.S. Constitution bars cruel and unusual punishment. Right. And the courts agreed. The court said, that's right. It is cruel and unusual punishment to do this. This case was appealed by Grants Pass up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Grants Pass does not agree with these decisions and is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to find that the Constitution does not protect the rights of unhoused people.
Wow. And so this will be coming up this term.
Yes.
And so what role does the center have when the suit hits the Supreme Court?
Absolutely. So the National Homelessness Law Center has been tracking laws like the law in Grants Pass that penalize unhoused people for having no place to go. We have been tracking those laws for decades. What we have seen is actually, as homelessness has increased, particularly over the last 5 to 7 years, the number and incidence of these laws penalizing unhoused people has also increased. And so we worked very closely with the Oregon Law Center as they were bringing the case, representing Gloria Johnson and other members of the unhoused community there. And when the case reached the Supreme Court, we have been working with organizations all across the country to file additional briefs with the Supreme Court explaining how many people are affected by homelessness. We're talking about people who've experienced domestic violence and sexual assault. We're talking about people who have had loss of family members, loss of wage earners, and lost their home. We're talking about veterans. We're talking about elderly persons. We're talking about young people under the age of 24 who have no safe place to live. There are many, many, many people affected by homelessness who do not have a safe place to go, just like in Grants Pass.
And so this is obviously the focus is on this case because it would have huge, right, implications.
Unquestionably.
Yeah, to your efforts to protect the rights of homeless, right?
Absolutely.
So that was Grants Pass, looking at, for example, the state of Kentucky that I know has some issues. Can you talk a little bit about state of Kentucky issue and then any kind of urban like San Diego? Given the climate in San Diego, I know they have, a lot of homeless people.
Yes, yes.
It's a beautiful place.
Yes, yes.
But can you talk a little bit about the Kentucky case and then the San Diego?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, we've seen a rise in laws or state legislatures taking up laws looking at how to penalize the lives of unhoused people. In particular, that there is an organization called the Cicero Institute that has been advancing laws across the country to penalize the lives of unhoused people and defund affordable housing in the states where they are advancing bills, essentially taking away the major tool, affordable housing, which can be used to end homelessness. They advanced a bill in the state of Kentucky to do those things, but they added an additional element to it that really is a warning shot regarding how aggressive these pieces of legislation have been. The bill in Kentucky adds a provision allowing a homeowner to essentially use force, including deadly force, against an unhoused person. These laws are typically called stand your ground laws. They have largely been repealed across the country as very harmful laws. I think we generally recognize as a nation that other than trained members of the police force or military, it's unsafe to have other people use deadly force against citizens. But in Kentucky, they want to pass a law allowing homeowners to use deadly force against unhoused people. This law really is an indicator of where jurisdictions are pushing to be able to oppress people who simply do not have another place to go. And it is frightening, frankly.
Right. Well, it sounds like both of those. I mean, obviously the Supreme Court and then the Kentucky initiative. So I think everybody, really cares about homeless people in the elements that don't have enough food and don't have housing. But what's the issue where in the richest country in the world, a bipartisan bill was passed in 2022 that threw billions of dollars at all of the states and all the municipalities through grants for infrastructure. And I know HUD's got programs, but how do we miss this curve of 600,000 people not having housing? I mean, that it's a lot of people, but it's not a big percentage necessarily
Sure.
of the population. How are we missing this? With the resources we have, why can't we get more shelters and through federal funding, through the state of Maryland, and the legislature's underway right now. I'm sure you tracked it in your past engagements in Baltimore, but they give money to projects, to public projects. So how are we missing that connection between federal, state grants and really being targeted in an effective, cost-effective way to provide shelters?
Sure. I think there are two issues at root here. The first is that, yes, a tremendous amount of money goes into providing shelters and other kinds of emergency assistance to address homelessness.
Right.
But shelters in and of themselves do not end homelessness. The only thing that is going to end homelessness is housing. And frankly, the federal government has disinvested in affordable housing over the last 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, when we do have the big outlays.
So can you make a distinction between a shelter and affordable housing?
Sure.
In terms of, the structural
Absolutely.
issue? Yeah.
So in a shelter, like an emergency shelter,
Right.
typically you're staying in a facility. You might be in a room with many other people. Okay. You might be sleeping on a cot or a bunk bed. And often you can only stay in that facility for 60 or 90 days or a limited
Gotcha.
period of time.
Gotcha.
If you live in a community with very expensive housing like Montgomery County,
Right.
it can be very difficult to find an apartment in 60 days, especially when you need one that's affordable. And Montgomery County does not have enough deeply affordable housing for the residents who make minimum wage or less.
Gotcha.
So 60 days is not going to be enough time for people to be able to find an apartment. And what I mean by affordable housing is an apartment with a lease that they hold on their own and where they pay rent. And at that point, once someone has a lease and a home of their own, then they're no longer homeless. They have a home. Yes. So the shelters are certainly an important service
Right.
when folks have nowhere else to go,
Right.
but they are not in and of themselves
The solution.
the solution.
Gotcha.
Secondly, when we have the big outlays of federal dollars from Congress during an emergency like the pandemic, they are allocating those to states, as you said, for infrastructure. But that doesn't mean that every state is making the decision to allocate that to providing housing and services to unhoused people.
Got it.
And so, the state of Maryland, frankly, would have seen a much higher increase in homelessness if it hadn't taken the steps it did to try to allocate housing and income supports to people who were on the brink of eviction. But many states did not take those steps as the state of Maryland did.
Got it.
And that's why we're seeing that huge rise. Yes, yeah.
Well, Antonia, I wanted to, as sort of a last question, I mean, our viewers are pretty diverse. I think Channel 16 does use YouTube, so we do hit a broad audience. What can people do? You drive, for example, you don't see it everywhere in Montgomery County, but I've seen some homeless in the lower county. I've seen homeless tents in Rock Creek Park. What can people do? I mean, the Law Center is certainly an important tool to that. But what's your suggestion to people that care about the homeless? How can they help?
Absolutely. Well, first, I will say, lead with kindness. If someone is asking for water or some food, and you have the flexibility to provide that, please do that. People are struggling, and a little bottle of water or half a sandwich will go a long way. If you are an attorney and you are interested in representing unhoused people in Maryland, I encourage you to contact the Homeless Persons Representation Project, which is an excellent legal services provider and runs a very strong pro bono program that you can get involved and be a part of the solution. In Washington, D.C., the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless does the same. Both programs are truly excellent. If you are not an attorney, if you're a doctor, I encourage you to reach out to Healthcare for the Homeless or a nurse or a medical practitioner of some variety. Healthcare for the Homeless is a wonderful program and could really use your supports. Here in Montgomery County, there are other wonderful programs that utilize volunteers that are not, they don't have a professional background leading into it. I encourage you to reach out to the Montgomery County Coalition for the Homeless and other programs. The county's Interagency Commission on Homelessness also has avenues to volunteer. We are asking for your support in all sorts of ways. And I should also say, for folks who want to learn more about the U.S. Supreme Court case, you can go on the internet to johnsonvgrantspass.com and learn more about the Supreme Court case and how to get involved and be a part of our nationwide campaign called Housing Not Handcuffs.
Well, Antonia, thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for your leadership in the Law Center, and also for taking time to join us here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that is David Winstead with In the Know, and Antonia Fasanelli, who's joined us from the National Homeless Law Center. I hope you've found it productive. Thank you.